Thank you all for coming. My name is Dave Campbell. I'm one of the co-chairs of the ACT Canada Knowledge Mobilization Committee. And our speaker today is my fellow co-chair. So we'll hear from Justin in just a moment. But as many of you probably know, we have been hosting a monthly webinar series on knowledge mobilization as it relates to clinical trials as part of ACT Canada's efforts to improve the knowledge sharing in the clinical trial ecosystem across Canada. And so we've had some wonderful speakers in this series, and today is no exception. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Justin Perceau, who is our speaker today. And most of you, I'm sure, know Justin. I know that he's a leader in the knowledge mobilization and implementation space. And so we're really thrilled to hear from him today. He'll be speaking on drawing on the foundations and frontiers of implementation science to accelerate the impact of clinical trials. So Justin, I'll pass it over to you and let you take it away.
Fabulous. Thanks, Dave. And thank you everyone for making the time in your day and your schedule. So yeah, as Dave mentioned, we've had just a real fantastic series of webinars focusing on thinking about different aspects of knowledge mobilization as it relates to the clinical trial ecosystem in Canada. And we thought it might be helpful, we hope it might be helpful to complement those webinars with a consideration of how the field of implementation science might have a role to play. So what I'm hoping to cover over the next little bit is some of the foundational elements of implementation science and almost a more traditional way of thinking about it, of how it can be a complement to moving trial evidence into practice. But then also towards the end, start to consider, are there ways of bringing in perspectives of implementation science within the context of conducting trials as well to accelerate their conduct. Before I jump in, just disclosures. I have the privilege of doing my research funded by a number of different funders on the left. Don't have any industry funding, and also just want to flag that in addition to this this committee, I have the opportunity to co-chair knowledge mobilization and implementation science streams for a couple of other national networks. And so bringing some of those perspectives to bear in our conversation here this morning and this afternoon, depending where you're joining from. So to start things off, I thought it would be worth sort of highlighting where I typically come at this from, that when we think about trials, clinical trials, they're rigorously conducted clinical trials evaluate innovations, and those innovations have the potential and do improve the health and wellness of people around the world. But conducting as rigorously as we can at different phases of the process, presenting the findings, publishing a trial, even in the highest impact journals in our respective fields, does not mean that the findings of the trials will achieve the impact of improving the health and wellness of people around the world. And that's where I think implementation science has a role to play in supporting achieving that impact. So as I said, what I'm hoping to cover is just exploring ways that implementation science might be able to contribute to accelerating the impact of clinical trials and maybe even the trials themselves by looking at foundations and frontiers. So let's start off with some foundational elements. And in order to do that, I think it's worth asking ourselves, why are we even thinking about implementation? Why is implementation important? We're talking about clinical trials. One of the reasons that I think it's worth thinking about implementation, even if you're a trialist, is that we're investing hundreds of billions of dollars every year in biomedical and health research, including in trials. And yet clinical and health services research continuously find that a consistent finding of a suboptimal translation of what we're finding in research reaching practice or policy changes. And depending on the literatures that you look at, consistently it tends to be the case that between 30 and 40% of people are arguably not receiving care according to current scientific evidence, and that some of the care that is provided may be lower value or not needed, that could be replaced. And so we could approach this with a deep dive in Canada. And so this is a paper by my colleague Janet Squires and colleagues, which for my money is, I think, one of the more important papers in the country over the last couple of years. And so what they did was look for studies that reported on gaps between what evidence might suggest a particular clinical practice should be engaged in, and then what is actually happening on the ground in terms of routine care, and trying to identify studies that try to conceptualize any of those gaps in care. They identified 170 plus studies, 220 different practices covering almost 30 million patients over that time span. And across those studies, identified a median proportion of inappropriate care at 30%, primarily driven by underuse of evidence in care, but there's some examples of overuse as well. And so these are studies that are not only based on whether trial evidence is being translated into practice, but and often the case in looking at clinical practice guideline recommendations and other recommendations or policies and whether those are being enacted or not. And when you dig a little bit deeper into this this great review, it's striking to me that there's kind of no clinical practice or disease or condition that's kind of spared. It covers, there's examples from ranging from lab tests to referrals, blood test imaging, but also specific procedures, particular therapies and drugs and medications across a range of different chronic and acute conditions. And so this is where, and so in some ways, the part of the justification for thinking about the science of implementation comes into play. And sometimes definitions are useful, and this is one that I find pretty helpful in thinking about implementation science as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice. So the point here, or the Coles notes of it, is it's the science, or aspires to be the science of bridging what we know and what we do in practice. With the idea that we're trying to learn as we go across jurisdictions and settings to develop a generalizable and or transferable empirical basis so that we don't have to start from scratch every time we're trying to implement and support change in the system, but rather can continually build an understanding of how to support healthcare teams and healthcare organizations to draw from what the trial evidence and other research evidence is suggesting might be the highest possible care to provide. And so one way to think about an approaching implementation science is to think about the processes that we could take once a trial has been conducted and the findings been accessible. And one thing about implementation science that I recognize from the start is that it is heavy on the frameworks, and I promise I will only do a very light touch on frameworks with you today. But where I do bring in a couple of frameworks, it's in hopes that helps us to think through particular aspects of implementation science. So one, in my mind, very important framework that many of you are likely familiar with was developed by Ian Graham, another one of my colleagues down the hall here, called the Knowledge to Action Framework. And the main aspects to think about with this particular framework are twofold. That in the center of the circle is the knowledge creation funnel. This is where the primary studies live, and it gets synthesized and then turned into some sort of a product or tool to be implemented. Whereas the outer ring is where the implementation activities and research tend to take place. So when you think about that kind of knowledge inquiry, that first step, this is where clinical trials are. This is individual clinical trials. So in some ways, the end point of a clinical trial is really the starting point of a knowledge to action process. But within this framework, there's a recognition that no one individual trial necessarily may be enough to justify moving changes into practice. And so often there's a move towards what can we pull together? Can we conduct a knowledge synthesis, a systematic review of similar interventions that have been evaluated in trials to start to build up a broader idea of the overall efficacy or effectiveness of a given therapy that's being evaluated, and then moving that into different types of ways of providing those that evidence to those who can make use of it. So this is where clinical practice guidelines come in, or policy briefs, or decision aids. But this is really just the starting point of an implementation research process. This is often the starting point of where my team might get involved. For example, once we have those strong trial evidence, the knowledge products, how do we then ensure that we can support different teams to incorporate that within the routine care that they're providing? And that this is where that recognition that publishing the trials and even the systematic reviews of trials and producing clinical practice guidelines, presenting them at conferences, clearly super important, but not likely on their own in most cases to promote changes in practice and policy. But that isn't to say that dissemination of findings of different types is not important. It is crucially important, and raising awareness is an important part and goal of the process, but often not the same as promoting practice change. There's more than being aware of trial findings that guides how practice change can take place. But if you're interested in the dissemination aspect or dissemination side of knowledge mobilization, I would point you to this second, I promised not too many frameworks, but second framework that does a neat job of trying to distill what a bunch of other more specific dissemination frameworks are really on about in terms of how to approach rigorous dissemination, which is the guider framework. Which, for my money, the bottom line here is when disseminating any kind of research evidence, their suggestions are to be thoughtful and partnered and don't jump straight to the message design, that there are other steps around who your audience might be and the dissemination partners and what barriers might be in play before you actually disseminate the message. But I'm going to focus beyond the dissemination side for the rest of the conversation today. Now, one of the ways to think about it, or one of the recognitions in implementation science is pretty jargon heavy, which is can sometimes be a challenge. And Jeff Curran wrote this, I find, really helpful jargon busting paper in implementation science communications a few years ago, which I find just really helpful to situate where we're talking about when we're thinking about trials versus the implementation of trials. And so if we were to pull apart the knowledge to action framework so that the knowledge creation funnel sits on the top and then the action cycle on the bottom, what Jeff Curran might suggest is the intervention, the technology, the drug, the therapy, this is the thing. And trials, efficacy effectiveness research looks at whether the thing works. And so the knowledge creation funnel, in other words, is where the clinical trials live, the thing lives. Whereas implementation research looks at how best to help people and places use the thing. Implementation strategies are the stuff that we do to try to help people and places use that thing. Implementation barriers and enablers are what strategies address to help people and places do the thing. And key outcomes in implementation activities are how much, how well, how long people and places use the thing. So hopefully that's if you're relatively new to the kind of implementation science space, that this is a helpful way to distinguish the thing, the trial, or what's being evaluated in the trial from how we approach implementation thereafter. So with that broader context in mind, if we're thinking about implementation science in traditional terms, where do we start? And I would say the first place to start is to recognize that implementation science is a team sport, that partnership, engagement, and co-production at every step is utterly foundational, whether we're talking about patient and public partners, through to healthcare professionals and teams, through organizational decision makers, that implementation science is not a desk-based sit at your desk and not talk to anyone type of game, that partnership from the start and throughout is essential to ensure that the approaches taken to ultimately land practice change are bringing in the perspectives of those ultimately part of the process. But assuming that is in place, often an approach in a standard implementation setting is that there might have been a clinical trial that has been conducted, maybe a few different clinical trials that have been synthesized, and maybe some knowledge tools and products like a guideline being developed. And so often the starting point is, what do we know about what's currently happening in the system? What's currently being done? Is there a discrepancy between current practice and what might be needed for what has been evaluated in the clinical trial to actually be implemented or optimized? So we might ask ourselves, how do we find these gaps? How do we know if there's a discrepancy? There's different ways, audit data using routinely collected data, looking at reports and reviews like the one that Janet Squires and colleagues led, are ways to start to point at where are the discrepancies to focus on. And then sometimes a traditional approach might be to say, okay, we have this gap that we want to implement. There's really strong trial findings that suggest we should make this change in practice. A common approach might be, let's set a meeting, brainstorm some solutions on a whiteboard together. Someone decides on a solution, maybe someone with less hair, someone with gray hair gets to make that decision, and then we implement that solution and we hope that it works. And some of those solutions might be things like, we need to develop a rigorous clinical practice guideline, but that in itself doesn't mean that it will be implemented or used in practice. It might lead to a favorite solution being selected, which may or may not be fit for purpose for a given setting. We might think what we need to do is bring people together for a meeting, for an educational event, which may be part of the solution, but depends what and how that educational event or CPD event is designed. Or maybe we gravitate towards we need a digital solution or an app to support implementation, which again may be part of the solution. Or we might have lots of different ideas and we're testing everything in the kitchen sink, which has led some of the thought leaders in implementation science to characterize that approach, that previous slide's approach, as really the most frequently used approach, frequently used implementation strategy in the literature, which they coined as the Islagiate approach, or it seemed like a good idea at the time approach, which isn't to say that people and teams don't have good ideas. People have lots of good ideas, and many of them are likely to be effective, but the risk here is the potentially expensive version of trial and error that may or may not draw on what we actually know works or doesn't work. So it builds in that Islagiate approach, might build in inefficiencies, insufficiencies of not drawing on what we know, relies mostly on tacit instead of transferable knowledge, so that we can't share what we're learning about implementation. And fundamentally, for me, that undermines creating a cumulative evidence base of what works for whom and where. And that lack of ability to accumulate evidence can ultimately become an equity issue, where other settings are not benefiting from what we're learning about how to implement in particular teams and settings. So if not Islagiate, then what? And one approach that has gained particular popularity over the last 20 years that the science of implementation has been building is to really break it down to 4 key steps that we ultimately, if we have some trial evidence that implies some change in practice that is recommended for change, we need to work out who needs to do what differently, where and when, what might stop them or help them from doing that, what strategies are best suited to address those barriers and enablers, and then putting our money where our mouth is where we can. Can we actually measure whether the strategies that we put in place actually lead to any changes in the care and practices that are being provided? And like I say, implementation science as a field continues to develop tools for each of these steps of the process. And I'll walk you through a few of those at a high level just to situate you if you're less familiar with this space. So the first step, that who needs to do what differently, where and when, is fundamentally about jobs. Whose job needs to change? Someone at some level is going to have to change what they're doing, usually more than one person, more than one level. And this potentially includes a wide range of people at different levels. And the more specific we can break that down, the more specific we can then decide, identify where might there be pinch points in the system that might act as barriers that we can ensure are addressed and supported as part of considering implementation. Once we figure out who needs to do what differently as part of implementing that trial evidence or that guideline recommendation, let's say, we ask ourselves, well, what might stop them from doing that? We don't want to guess. Ideally, we're trying to work closely and recognizing that the context might be important for us to understand. And this is where a lot of implementation science effort goes into drawing from models and frameworks as a way to provide a foundation of factors to consider when trying to work out what are the barriers and enablers, usually to try to then choose the right strategy to match the right set of barriers and enablers. A recognized challenge, I would say, in the literature in the implementation science field is there's a lot of models and frameworks, arguably too many models and frameworks, so much so that there are efforts to support people in trying to make decisions about which one to select and justify those. I'm not going to get into that today, but just to highlight that by and large, the field has in recent years tended to gravitate towards frameworks of barriers and enablers that consolidate many factors from many disciplines to cast a wide net when trying to understand a particular context in which evidence might be considered for implementation. So we might identify who needs to do what differently. We might identify the barriers and enablers to them doing that. This is where strategies start to come in. And I wish I could tell you that there is one go-to strategy that works all the time. As far as I can tell and reading the literature, that does not exist. If you found that, please let me know. That would make my life a lot easier. But short of that, that there's a need for considering how do we match in the given context for the given setting the right strategies to support teams in implementing. And a way to think about this that it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think has some utilities to think about this as a cooking analogy that, let's say, kind of chilly, it's certainly chilly in Ottawa these days. Imagine you're trying to think about cooking a nice winter stew for your family. Some ingredients for sure will make it delicious. Onion, garlic, carrots, potatoes, celeries, green beans, thyme and bay leaves, but some ingredients probably not so much. Adding chia seeds probably make it pretty gross. Some old oregano from the back of your cupboard, probably not that good. Adding too much garlic won't help. Would you just open your cupboard and pull all the possible ingredients that you have in your spice rack and put it in and hope that it makes it better? Probably not. Would you just make it up yourself? You definitely could. But that could involve lots of trial and error. And certainly if you're like me and have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old that are hungry at the end of the day, that trial and error is can lead to tears for sure. But the point here being is that I'm not suggesting that implementing is a cookbook exercise. There's much more to it than that, but rather to make the point that certain ingredients or certain strategies are better suited than others to address particular barriers, rather than going straight to the strategies themselves. And there's an emerging evidence base for how we actually work that out. And so this is where the strategies come in, that we can start to draw from implementation science because it provides a leg up on which strategies we might consider. Some of those strategies for implementation are actually linked to an effectiveness evidence base, which I'll highlight in a second. And some of those strategies are also specifically linked to barriers and particular barriers and enablers, so that you can be a bit more purposeful in identifying which strategies fit the best for the barriers that seem to be at play in a given setting considered for implementing the trial evidence. So you might see terms like taxonomies or list of implementation strategies, and there's a few of these that are used in implementation science. And by and large, they're designed, these lists, for a couple of reasons. They're to at least have a shared language for describing what we're actually doing, so that we're not coining new terms that are basically the same as existing strategies. It helps us to be clear. That's just important for fidelity and replication and optimization in other settings. And it might provide some new ideas, some novel ideas that might not be on your radar that have been considered by others. So I'll highlight 2 of those frameworks, not because I'm expecting you to know them in detail, but just to highlight that they're there as tools to be used. The first is something called the ACT taxonomy, developed by Byron Powell and colleagues, that really pulls together into 9 different high-level categories, a range of different implementation strategies. And this is what it looks like. I'm not expecting you to read it all, but only wanting to make the point that what they worked hard is to have clear distinctions between all these different strategies, particular labels for their use, and examples for how to operationalize them. So again, if you're in a room where you're working with a team to try to implement some evidence, that this becomes a useful tool, so that it's not just a whiteboard that you're working with, that you have this to draw from. A second complementary and similar taxonomy is something called the Effective Practice and Organization of Care, or EPOC taxonomy, which stemmed out of the EPOC Cochrane group, who had been tasked themselves to really focus on systematic reviews of interventions to improve professional practice and delivery of health services. So this is a kind of a one-stop shop for systematic reviews of evaluations in practice of implementation strategies, sometimes very rigorously tested implementation strategies. And so again, I'm not expecting you to read the detail, but the purpose here is clear labels and ways to operationalize, so that that can be useful for shared learning across settings. And to me, the EPOC taxonomy is a bit of a unicorn in the strategy literature space. And I say that because it's not just about being consistent about labels and operationalization and how to use these strategies, but it's embedded within an evidence synthesis ecosystem in Cochrane. And so its strong use is that we actually have an evidence base to support and to explore which are the most effective strategies in different settings. So here's just a sample of some of the most well-tested strategies in the EPOC list. And so on the left are the reviews themselves and the particular strategies. In the middle are the number of trials in those reviews. And on the right, the median improvement in clinical practice observed in these reviews. And so it might be obvious, but I'll just say for the sake of being pedantic, what these reviews are looking at are trials or cluster randomized trials of these strategies. So randomizing clinicians or teams or hospitals or clinics to receive and engage with these strategies or not, and then evaluating whether or not that changes clinical practice across a range of different areas. So you can see things like printed educational materials have been tested widely, different support, decision support systems, audit and feedback is a massive literature, educational meetings and workshops, opinion leaders, educational outreach visits. So not only are there ways to actually deliver these strategies, but there's an evidence base to support why we might suggest if it feels like it fits the barrier enabler setting of our implementation, that there might be some good evidence to suggest that it might be actually potentially effective. So we've done that work. We need to do what differently? Barriers and enablers, strategy mapping. A big piece of implementation science is not just about designing those implementation packages, but actually evaluating whether does it actually make a difference to the care provided and the health and wellness of patients thereafter. And so there's also a literature to highlight particular implementation outcomes. So this is a classic one by Enola Proctor and colleagues that highlight the particular metrics that or outcome measures that might be in an implementation evaluation. We might be interested in acceptability, adoption, appropriateness, feasibility, fidelity, cost, penetration, sustainability as classic measures, but also practice change as a clear focus of implementation strategy evaluation. And there's a very mature literature in this space around, just as within the clinical trial ecosystem of rigorous clinical trial conduct, there is a parallel literature suggesting how to conduct what's known as randomized implementation trials. And so in many cases, leveraging a lot of the same designs that we might think about in patient randomized clinical trials, but applying them that same level of design rigor to evaluate implementation strategies, and sometimes in cluster randomized fashions where appropriate. So I point you to that to highlight it, especially if you have a trial bent on the more clinical trial side, and you haven't really yet considered how that skill set might apply in the implementation world. Trial-based implementation scientists would be welcoming your input into that because there's a big literature on implementation trials specifically for guiding that. Sometimes innovations are already in place, or there's a window of opportunity for implementing a particular piece of evidence or a particular high important opportunity that has some evidence base behind it that justifies just going with our best guess, our as-lagid approach. That doesn't mean there isn't a place necessarily for implementation science in those places either. That there's potentially an opportunity to iterate if you're so inclined. So you might think about, let's say, this year. At baseline, there's already something happening in the health system, and there's an implementation strategy that's decided amongst the leadership for that health system. But there might be some strategies that are left on the chopping room floor or are not decided upon, but could be viable options. So that presents an opportunity for the next year, that maybe in the next year, if it's possible, maybe we randomize whether we use that same strategy again versus another new strategy, and we test them against each other. If that's a better strategy, that becomes the baseline and the foundation going forward. And then we continue to iterate. Maybe we test strategy C in the next year, but maybe it costs more than B with no major improvements, so we stick with B, and so on. So there's ways to think about these sequential A/B testing of implementation evaluations within the context of existing implementation and existing settings. That doesn't mean we have to start from scratch and front load all this, 1, 2, 3, 4 that I just walked through before actually doing anything. This next few slides I wanted to highlight, going back to that unicorn epoch taxonomy that I flagged as examples of how that strategy list has been used to to really make sense of what works best in particular types of literature. So what I'll start off with, this is an example of work led by Kristen Conyu from Aberdeen that looked at quality improvement strategies and implementation strategies for diabetes care across the board and tried to unpack what strategies across improving diabetes care seem to work best mapped to these EPOC strategies. So this is a massive review, 533 trials, and they focused on particular subset of the EPOC taxonomy strategies that focus on the system, the providers, and patients. And here, interestingly, not only were they interested in practice change, they were interested in does using those implementation strategies actually follow through to changes in clinical outcomes for patients in the trials in the review. So the classic type of key diabetes-related indicators like glycemic control and blood pressure and cholesterol, and then some of the behavioral smoking and screening activities that patients might be involved in as part of their diabetes management. So what's really neat about this review is what they were able to do because of the amount of trials in the review is look at what combination of implementation strategies seem to be associated with an improvement in a range of these different clinical indicators. And in some cases, they could compare different thresholds. So if we take the glycemic control, they had enough trials to look at when the average HbA1c was above 8.3, certain combination of implementation strategies was associated with a decrease in HbA1c, whereas when HbA1c on average was lower than 8.3, a different combination. So this becomes quite a powerful set of evidence if you're a diabetes primary care clinician thinking to try to improve HbA1c in your patients and your case mix is, above 8.3, you might think about which strategies could be put in place to improve HbA1c with these implementation strategies, which is an evidence and trial-informed approach to draw and improve care based on ultimately feeding back from the trial evidence that led to these types of care being in place. So that's an example across diabetes care. Another example is looking at specific aspects of care. So here's an example of within, again, the diabetes literature, diabetic retinopathy screening as a recommended part of diabetes self-management specifically. And so the team here identified 66 trials up to 2017 when they last updated this review, and overall saw an improvement of 12% across all the trials evaluating implementation strategies. But again, they then unpacked the content of the strategies in these trials using the EPOC strategy list and found that specific EPOC strategies were associated with an increase, a higher increase in retinopathy screening attendance, which again, if you're planning out a retinopathy screening program to implement that in a different jurisdiction, it might be helpful to have this layer of evidence to make decisions depending on the barriers that are at play. And then the last example that I want to give around this EPOC strategy is deep diving into a particular strategy. And I hinted at this a few slides ago, that there's some literatures that are very rich in lots of trial evidence, randomizing clinicians or clinical teams to receive an implementation strategy or not, and testing if that changes their practice. So audit feedback is one of those literatures. The audit feedback, if you're not familiar, is leveraging routinely collected healthcare data, performance data, and highlighting discrepancies between recommendations or benchmarks and actual care, and presenting that back to clinicians and to teams as part of a process of supporting improved care. Lots of trials, lots of large-scale trials internationally and in Canada, using and demonstrating the effectiveness of this particular strategy. But even more powerful, arguably, is the synthesis of all those trials. And so Noah Ivers has been the international lead on this for a while now in keeping up to date with this literature, and highlighted in the most recent update just last year overall 6.2 mean absolute improvement in practice in the trials that are using audit and feedback. And because, again, of the volume of this review, they are able to unpack when is audit and feedback particularly effective, when it's individual level data versus team level, when you compare to top peers or benchmark, and so on. So again, it's helpful when you're making decisions and planning out a program to know not just that audit and feedback might be a viable option, but if you really want to get the most out of it, we actually have evidence to suggest of how to best design it as well, that it's rooted in trial evidence. But for feedback specifically, I just want to make the point that just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's lots of routinely collected data, lots of dashboards available, and not all feedback is created equal. And there are really good tools and accessible tools that highlight if you're just starting out and have access to lots of data and feedback seems to be the right potential approach to support clinical teams. You don't have to start from scratch, that you can draw from the best evidence for how to design these feedback tools. So that, in a relatively large nutshell, is what I would say is kind of traditional way of, or one of the traditional ways of thinking about implementation science and its role traditionally in within the overall evidence generation and impact ecosystem after trials have been conducted. But I want to start to move into some of the newer areas of implementation science, especially for those of you who are clinical trialists yourselves and asking yourself, that's great, but where do I fit in more generally? We'll talk about some of the frontiers. First, I want to talk about some of the more active areas that are kind of implied in what I talked about earlier, but are worth emphasizing because it's where implementation scientists are spending a lot of time thinking right now. One is de-implementation, one is sustainment, and the third is equity. So I'll just touch on each of these a little bit. Implementing an evidence base that is drawn from a clinical trial foundation doesn't always mean doing something more, doing something new. Sometimes it means replacing, sometimes it means stopping, doing an existing practice. And there's an emerging literature around what do we understand about the barriers and strategies for reducing, stopping it. They're not necessarily the same as those that are needed for getting something going or implemented in the first place. That second kind of frontier area of implementation science is it's clearly important that we want to be focusing on implementing, getting going, but keeping going or sustaining a practice also has its specific barriers and strategies to consider and should be considered as early as possible so that we don't assume that sustainment is going to happen. And there's a range of efforts to try to help think through that sustainment angle. And one that I want to point you to is by the team in Newcastle in Australia that characterize approaches used by policy and practice agencies to achieve sustained implementation. And they characterized three different flavors of sustainment that organizations often take. That there's the self-sustain approach where implementation or change in practice continues by that organization without any external support. Then there's static sustainment support, which is a predefined external support that is continued, that was in from the start and continues. And then there's the more dynamic version of that. The external support might vary and it be adapted over time. And then the third frontier area that a lot of implementation science are thinking about right now is how we think about ultimately change in practice, implementing trial evidence for the benefit of patients and populations worldwide. It's an equity issue. The more places get access to the trial evidence that we're generating through practice change and better care, the better. But that has to be done with authenticity and intentionality because there's in my view, underrepresented risk of the potential for implementation generated inequities. So what I mean by that is if the same hospitals and the same clinics and the same health professionals are the ones that are always in the same implementation space, they will continue to be improved, but potentially itself generating or risking generating inequities by being part of that ongoing process, even if not done on purpose. And so it's worth thinking about carefully. Implementation approaches have the potential for ensuring the equitable scale and spread, but we need to be thinking about that generically across jurisdictions, and that's where national networks have, I think, an important role to play in ensuring that. Okay, last piece that I wanted to highlight is, and I hinted from the very start, is, okay, most implementation science is characterized as the science of how do we move the great evidence generated by trials into actual practice. But increasingly, there's a recognition that the methods and the approaches that we think about in implementation science might actually be helpful, or could it worth exploring whether they might be helpful in maybe even optimizing and accelerating the conduct of clinical trials themselves. And so the idea here is that instead of thinking about this as a practice change set of applications, can we move this more upstream? Can we pivot from implementing change in clinical care to optimizing the activities of clinical trials? Where are the aspects of clinical trials that need to be landed in order for an efficient trial to be conducted? And can we bring in some of these perspectives in order to support that to happen? So can we ask who needs to do what differently in the trial? What are the barriers and enablers to them doing that? What strategies might work best to address those barriers? And can we test if those strategies actually help to land that trial as intended? And probably the most active area of application of these ideas is in trying to optimize recruitment and retention in clinical trials. And this is off the back of a lot of evidence to suggest that, and you'll know this as a clinical trialist, if this is a space that you're in, that fundamentally the ability of a trial to fulfill its remit it depends on recruitment, and in some cases of retention over time, and continual data collection over time. And the time it takes to recruit and the ability to meet sample size targets often is a reason why trials fail to be to test viable options, and slows down the whole process of evaluation, providing access to potential life-saving therapies. So this is where that optimization of recruitment and retention, even though it's a very specific aspect of clinical trials, might benefit still from thinking through more carefully. And so there's a range of teams that have been starting to think, can we use those same frameworks, those same approaches, and ask ourselves, what are the barriers and enablers to recruitment and retention? And so here's a couple of examples as it relates to recruitment and how people have approached this that have been applied from trials ranging from early phase, in some case first in human trials, which you might ask, how can this apply to a first in human trial? I'll show you in a second, all the way through to province-wide multi-site clinical trials. So this first one is a very early phase, ahead of a very early phase trial of stem cells for bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which is an affliction of very premature babies that doesn't really have very many therapies available, that stem cells potentially a viable option. So we worked with a team of neonatologists and parents that might have, as they were planning their first trial of these mesenchymal stromal cells, to evaluate and to see how can we understand the potential barriers and enablers to parents agreeing to their premature baby to be part of the trial, and for neonatologists and the NICU teams to actually recruit parents. What are their perspectives, and taking a implementation framework approach to surface those perspectives in order to optimize the trial. Second is an example of the use of CAR T-cell therapy, in this case for blood cancers, and again, using a framework-based approach to surface what are the potential barriers and enablers to screening and recruiting patients to an eventual CAR T-cell therapy trial from the trial team hematologist perspective, as well as from the perspective of potential patients that would be eligible for an eventual trial, in that way to support the trial team's protocol development. And then finally, the last example is an example of large-scale planned trial of changing the temperature of dialysis machines to reduce the temperature of dialysis as part of a large-scale clinical trial being planned, and unpacking from the perspective of the professionals involved and having to actually change the temperature on the machines. How do we ensure that the trial can be delivered with fidelity? So I flag all these as examples of ways that implementation science perspectives have been brought to bear to support trial teams in trying their best to ensure the recruitment and fidelity of the intervention delivery that ultimately led to contributing to both the trial protocols and in some cases in some of the more mature examples, the actual trial itself. That's the retention side, or that's the recruitment side. There's also a lot of effort to think about retention using those same frameworks of how can we understand what are the barriers and enablers to making sure that, or supporting patients to follow up clinic attendance, to provide samples over time as part of their clinical trial participation, or where relevant to return surveys as part of let's say, a patient-reported outcome over time, to maintain the retention of participants over time. And so this is work led by Katie Gillies, again in Aberdeen, that is really trying to unpack and understand what are some of the challenges faced by patients in following up and returning questionnaires that might be able to be used as a foundation for better supporting them to stay in the trial. And her work is also focused on what strategies work best as well. And as she's done a Cochrane review to highlight what do we know so far about what retention strategies might work best. And so this, I find this a really exciting space. If this is an interest to you or to ACT more generally, I'm sure Katie and her team would be delighted to deliver one of these types of webinars in the future. So please let us know if that's of any interest. But a lot of this is built around how do we do this rigorously? Can we test strategies for recruitment and retention while we're doing clinical trials so that we're building up and sharing an evidence base of what works best to support patients in participating in trials and staying in them to maximize the ability for the trial to be meeting its sample size requirements for testing its efficacy or effectiveness. And so there's a whole emerging methodological area of studies within trials or SWATs to do this and consider this from design perspective and an ethics perspective to rigorously test and develop an understanding of how can we best support patients in participation. And finally, I wanted to highlight that if this is a space that is of interest, one of the activities that we've been doing within the ACT KM committee is to try to map out the expertise that we have across Canada right now in people that operate at the interface between clinical trials and implementation science. And so we've been, and some of you hopefully participated in this, if this is within your wheelhouse, that we've looked across the ACT networks and portfolio hospitals and CTUs. And so far I've identified just under 50 people characterized as that we might think of as having both trial and knowledge mobilization broadly expertise. And so we're now in a process of exploring ways to make that list more accessible and identifiable using, for example, the CCTAM, with the idea that if you're a trialist and you're wanting to dip your toe in the space and might benefit from some expertise, that we clearly have that expertise spread across the country within ACT itself and certainly beyond. And hopefully this asset map it will be helpful to those of you who might be thinking about bringing in some of these perspectives in the future. So last slide, take-home message. Rigorous evidence arguably has never been more important in this day and age, and conducting and publishing rigorous trials is critically important as part of that. But doing that, even recognizing how much effort it takes to actually run a clinical trial, publishing those findings doesn't mean that they will get used. This is where implementation science can be a partner, and it's a team sport that can involve clinical trialists right through to those working in the health system. That implementation is not the same as the science of implementation, and the science is trying to build in these tools and these approaches so that as you're thinking about implementing different practices based on trial evidence, that you don't have to start from scratch to make it up as you go. There's a lot of help and work and tools that can help you along the way, and expertise across the country, as I mentioned. There's been a ton of progress in the last 25 years that implementation science has been a thing, a field. I think, biased, but I think it's a pretty exciting, vibrant field that has so much potential to ensure that we land the promise of the trials that so many of you are conducting and actually having broad as impact as possible to leverage the benefit that the trial research is providing, and that implementation science might be able to provide some tools to help us at least accelerate the follow-through part of our trials. And based on those last few slides that I presented, hopefully maybe consider accelerating the conduct of the trials themselves through that recruitment retention side of things. Hope that was a helpful overview. We've got some time for questions, and if you think of something later, you can always reach me at this email address. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Justin. That's a wonderful overview of the field and raises lots of super helpful points. I think that was just a wonderful talk. And I'm just so you all are aware, I really liked how Justin commented on some of the other activities that our KM committee is doing. It's not just this webinar series, but he talked about the asset map that we're working on. And I did just want to throw a plug out to, we're currently in the process of working on some case studies as well. So if some of you are interested to learn a little bit more about how different people are doing CAM within trials, those will be coming out, and that's being led by Selena on our team, on our committee. And so those will be coming out through the ACT communication channels over the next month or 6 weeks. So keep your eyes out for those to kind of broaden your horizons as we think about KM. But we've got some 10 minutes or so for questions. So Justin, there's a couple in the chat there. Stuart
Yep.
is wondering about kind of the challenges of SWATs and if anybody's looked at what it's like to do those and the challenges people might face. So I don't know if you're aware of any literature on that.
Yeah, so this is the UK has been, there's a lot of folks in the UK working carefully on this, and I've not only been at the forefront of the methodological approaches and ethical considerations around SWATs, but also the kind of lessons learned as different SWATs have been conducted. I can't think of the specific challenges off the top of my head, honestly, but I would point you to that broader literature. I know there's a special issue of working through a number of different aspects of SWATs that is published, that I think in one of my slides. Give me a sec. If you look up the Prometheus program, that's a lot of the considerations around SWATs have been built within that context of that work. But as I mentioned, I planted that seed to some extent, mostly as a taster, in case there is some interest within the broader ACT community to maybe invite the folks that do this day in and day out to maybe present to the ACT community, if that's of interest.
Thanks, Justin. And I see Aviva put the link there. Thanks, Aviva. That's great. We've got, so keep your questions coming in the chat box, everybody. But we've got the question from Rosman, and then we'll go to Mark Leduc. But Rosman's question, Justin, there about whether you're aware of how AI is used in collaboration with implementation science.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I feel like we can ask that question just about every walk of life right now. But certainly there's lots of opportunity, I would say, to think about how AI might be able to accelerate some of the processes that I walked through in implementation science. That there are some aspects of evidence synthesis that take time, that are accelerated by some of the AI supports that are available within systematic review packages. It's an obvious one, but also some of the early barriers assessment work within the context of implementation work can be text-heavy, interview or focus group-based, which, if you're ever involved in that kind of research, is relatively time-consuming to work your way through coding. And so there's a lot of people that are working on leveraging natural language processing LLMs to support the coding, ideally with a human in the loop, but to accelerate the coding process itself. And similarly, thinking through how we can train LLMs to identify particular, epoch strategies within the reports of trials. So it's a very active area right now, and people are mostly looking at which, how effective are the most recent models. But it's such a fast-moving space that whenever a team tries to validate a particular version of a GPT, that the next one has been released, or the next one. And so certainly it's lots of opportunity there, I would say.
Thanks, Justin. That's great. Mark, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask a question? Maybe you answered it already. Any other questions? We've got a few minutes left here. Oh, Mark can't unmute. Go ahead and just type it in then if you'd like, Mark. There we go. You should be able to unmute now, Mark.
Nope, that looks promising.
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
So, Dr. Professor, so thank you so much. That was a lot, but a huge distillation of a ton of information. So I have lots of different questions, and then would love to follow up with you afterwards.
Yeah,
I guess with the limited time left, no single study often carries the day around changing practice, right? So then you got into the issue of sequencing and multiple studies that all collect and inform the field around what is effective care look like. So what is that? How do you? What would be your advice around managing the tension around the dissemination of findings within a particular study by clinicians and clinical leaders for adoption, right? And the typical yeah buts that we're going to get, or that investigators might get. You also tackled, I think brilliantly, the challenge that we're seeing both for Pillar 2 work, but also Pillar 3 health services research, where because a lot of these same issues apply there, I think, potentially across Pillar 4 as well. But where we've received, for instance, extension requests, no cost extension requests, where the justification or the main justification is they need the extra time for publication. And as a co-funder of some of these studies, it's like, well, that's great, absolutely. However, what is your plan to help translate your findings for our local context so that we, if your recommendation is this should become standard of care, how are you helping folks understand that in the center that you're working in, right? So beyond informing the rest of the field of this is good care, this is what care should look like. So those are just two pieces. There's more I have, but just first of all, thank you, ACT, for tackling this issue in a systematic way, and very keen to look deeper, at least in Alberta, on how we can apply this in our contexts.
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions and comments and thoughts there, and definitely keen to connect outside of this webinar. But some initial or some high level thinking there that yes, I guess there is a bit of a tension in like when is evidence ready for prime time? When should we what's the point of disseminating and when? And that's partly why I find it really useful to think about there is a role for awareness raising and dissemination, so that an evidence doesn't just accrue in a vacuum and they'll have to wait until there's this perfect set of trials that are synthesized and then go into clinical practice guidelines. That to me, one of the vehicles for better connections potentially is between trialists and those that it might be responsible ultimately for changing practice and policies, like clinical practice guideline teams, development teams, so that there's an argument for when do we need to update a guideline when a new big trials come out, or when there's a new evidence base that's starting to accrue even from early phase trials, that those that are in the guideline development space are aware that there's something coming up and it might be a trigger to maybe we need to renew a renewed effort. But to me, it's not an either or, that ultimately there's some decision making to be made within the particular context and settings, depending on the therapies that are being evaluated in trials and whether there's enough to justify it being ready for the sake of what needs to be addressed. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be another trial that's going to happen eventually. And so in the background, there's always that evidence synthesis opportunity. And then it's more of a judgment call on when is the right evidence needed at that point to make a decision. COVID is the obvious example there. For when was there sufficient evidence to justify making decisions given the context that the particular vaccines were in order to make a decision there. But it's potentially different for less crisis or situations where the evidence is slowly accruing over time. I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but yeah, happy to connect again. And to me, it's just the key point in my mind is it's not an either or situation, that sometimes decisions need to be made for other reasons than building up this broader evidence. But in the background, there's always this opportunity to be iterating and trying to think about how do we make sure that we land the evidence when it's available.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justin. I think we have time for one last question. Laura typed it in the chat box there, but I've also just enabled your mic, Laura, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. That was an excellent overview. I really appreciated it. When you're writing a grant for an implementation trial, these grants are often complicated because you have interventions at different levels. Like you have the what and then the how, and sometimes the system level. And then you have all these different theories and models to choose from, and often reviewers have preferences about which ones they like better. And so then there's all these kind of points at which a reviewer can be critical. It's just a lot easier to criticize because they're not as clean as an efficacy trial where you're like, here's your treatment, does it work or not, right? And I'm just wondering, because then you need reviewers with this solid expertise, and people have varying levels of expertise and they're being asked to review, especially when you go to say like an RCT panel where that you may not necessarily have the same implementation science expertise. So I'm just wondering if you have advice for people who are writing these types of grants for getting them clear enough, and I guess streamlining them or getting any advice really. But the other thing is there's this 10-page limit, so you have to fit all of that in that limit. So do you have any advice for people writing these types of grants, so that we can have them be equally as successful as efficacy trials?
Yeah, this is maybe literally $1 million question. Yeah, the grants personship aspect of funding this kind of work is such an important aspect. And part of my initial thought is we need to continue to build capacity in this space. And that's part of why we have this asset map, is that building capacity, and then those folks at different career stages being part of panels and others advocating for having those roles on different CIHR panels, including the trial committee, but not only the trial committee and other committees, that the more expertise with knowledge mobilization and implementation considerations are on the panels, the better will be better placed to have a fair crack at recognition of the rigor that goes into some of this work. So there's a bit of a funder system aspect to this. I think that I feel quite strongly about that we need to be. It's one of the reasons for building our collective capacity, not only at the training level, but in the investigator and PI level too, so that we can have representation on committees. But in the meantime, or depending on the committees that you're sending it to, I don't know if I have the right answer to this. I have some thoughts, but I think part of it is thinking through what, besides the trial committee, are there other committees that other panels that might be better fits? So there's the KTR committee that specifically looks at knowledge translation and research, that could consider part of this depending on the size of what is being evaluated, and whether it's in scope. And then depending on the size of the grant, it may or may not need to go through the trial panel itself, and particular committees that are discipline or clinical area specific might consider it. But again, to your point, depends on the expertise in that panel, which goes back to, I think we need to advocate for the chairs to be securing membership within the committees that have these implementation studies, if they're seeing them in their committees. That's maybe a high level. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but it's a great question.
I think the other committee, the health services, HS 1, 2, and 3 are quite used to seeing implementation trials as well. So that might be one you can consider as well. But thank you all for being here. We're over time, so thank you so much. I wanted to give a special thanks to Sierra and Alyssa for organizing this meeting, to Justin for speaking, and to all of you for being here. We will have another webinar in March, so stay tuned for that. And as I said, stay tuned for the other outputs from our committee, the asset map and the case studies that will be forthcoming. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.